Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So it's presumably the last day the Assembly is in session. I can't in good conscience leave without talking about our public schools and the importance of them and standing up for them. This is an important bill. We've heard from so many different rural school administrators and educators across the state. They've been calling for a long time for an increased investment in our rural public schools. These are the hubs of our communities. With declining enrollment and the ever-increasing cost of transportation, now is the time to grant our rural communities the funds they desperately need to continue educating our children. Yet the legislative majority cannot be bothered to do this for us. I ask you, what is more important than our children's education, Mr. Speaker, and why hasn't this bill been brought forward when so many have asked for it? I want to share with you all a startling and enlightening report on the state of our rural schools from the Appleton Post-Crescent. And I quote, "When rural districts need to stretch dollars, staffers often do more than one job. In Cuba City, the math and computer teacher are the same person. In Mineral Point, the superintendent also serves as business manager and director of technology. Rural educators struggling with high transportation costs, old buildings, and the loss of staff told state lawmakers studying the issue that their employees and budgets have been stretched to the limit. Without more money, they will have to close schools and could see massive deficits, and their best teachers leave for better paying jobs elsewhere. But lawmakers on a special task force said an overall funding increase is unlikely, although some money might be found for specific needs. The gentleman from the 34th, a Rhinelander Republican and task force chairman, said the committee initially aimed to get rid of inefficiencies and find cost-saving measures, not dish out more money to schools. He was surprised during visits to rural schools to see them stripped to bare bones. Dozens of rural districts are slated to ask voters April 1st for money just to keep operating and avoid closing schools. Many are likely to fail. Referendums are just tearing these schools apart, the gentleman from the 34th said, noting the votes in Rhinelander were narrowly split. This is all from the Appleton Post-Crescent. So my question is, Mr. Speaker, how can anyone be surprised? How can anyone in this body? I'm stunned that any member of this body could ever question that our rural schools have been stripped to the bare bones when Republicans in the legislature have absolutely assaulted our public schools over the past 3 years. I'm shocked that anyone would not be able to realize the full effects and outcomes of the devastating legislation Republicans have perpetrated against our schools. So let me just outline what you've done in case you've forgotten, because I think this needs to be said before we break. First, you waged a war on our educators by stripping them of their bargaining rights and cutting their pay. Then we hear over and over again that we can't retain and attract quality teachers. 50% of our teachers leave education after 5 years. It's because, in the words of Senator Dale Schultz, quote, "Every hero needs an enemy, and someone made the decision that public educators are going to be the enemy," end quote. At the same time, Republicans made the strictest levy limit yet imposed on local governments and imposed a state cap on property tax increases. Then the Republican chairman of the Rural Task Force says, without noting the irony, referendums are just tearing these schools apart. That's what you've driven our schools to resort to, and it's unsustainable and wrong. Indeed, according to that same article, the Unified School District of Antigo, one of the state's largest geographically, was not as fortunate. 3 referenda there to consolidate 3 elementary schools into 1 to save money have failed. The district has cut 88 employees, 10 bus routes, and reduced employee benefits and maintenance projects in the last decade, School Board President Mike Boldig said. There have been years when, for our particular district, we've had to look at making over $1 million in cuts just to make the budget, Boldig said, and Rhinelander faced similar cuts. So let's be clear here. Republicans have perpetrated a $1.6 billion cut, the largest in our state's history. And you've cut our teachers and our classrooms and our buildings and our bus routes, and now you're just noticing, after 3 years of cuts, that you've not only stripped our schools of all its fat to bare bones, but now you're cutting into the bone, and you're only just noticing. Bear these consequences in mind. Your poor policy choices have negative outcomes that directly affect your constituents. And when you see these outcomes in person, don't you dare be surprised. How can you be surprised when this is all part of the plan of a concerted effort to incrementally privatize education? You're skimming money off of the top of public education budgets for private voucher schools that don't even have the same accountability standards as our public schools. You've conveniently killed that bill as well. I stand against this plan and everything I've listed that you've done to our public schools. Bear this in mind. Bear these outcomes in mind. You've gone way too far, Mr. Speaker. So the least you could do, the very, very least, is support sparsity aids for our rural schools before we break. Let's see if you have it in you, if you care at all about our schools, about our children, and about our future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.